biology. I just find it interesting. And usually after I spend a little bit of time on those websites, I begin to ask the question, well, why would God create these kinds of odd and bizarre and unusual creatures? Right? Why would God create these kind of creatures? What purpose could they serve? And as we will discover this evening, as we probe that question, we actually gain insight into who God is, and also we gain insight into who we are as human beings made in God's image. But before we kind of get into some of that heavy lifting tonight, what I'd like to do is just spend a couple of minutes and show you some of my favorite odd and unusual and bizarre creatures. All right, so the first one is called the sea pig. Any of you ever heard of the sea pig? This is actually a sea cucumber. It's an echinoderm, and it lives on the ocean floor. In fact, it's one of the dominant life forms in what's called the abyssal ocean, which is the ocean floor where you have the deepest waters. And this is a scavenger. It eats debris, and it has these leg-like structures that it uses to move around, these appendages on its back that serve as kind of a detection system where it will detect nutrients in the ocean and move towards those nutrients and then suck them up with these little suction devices at the anterior of the organism. But there are some pretty impressive video footage of a whale carcass at the bottom of the ocean floor, just literally covered with thousands of these sea pigs. They're about an inch and a half in size. Now, this is a great fish, one of my favorites. This is called the red-lipped batfish, right? And we were joking today at the office. It's like that could be a great insult, right? Just go ahead and kiss a red-lipped batfish, right? But this is actually found off of the Galapagos Islands, about 1.5 feet in length, and can't swim, actually. It's a fish that can't swim, and it's got red lips. I mean, talk about being dealt a bad hand, right? And so it just moves around on the ocean floor using its fins as like leg-like structures. Okay, this is quite an adorable little creature. Right? This is called the pink fairy armadillo, and it's found in the deserts of central Argentina. And this is a solitary creature, a nocturnal creature that actually can't live outside of the desert environment. When people have taken this creature out of its natural habitat, within days it dies. So as cute as it is, as adorable, it's tempting to want to make this a pet. You can't do that, unfortunately. Yeah. All right, this is a creature that only a mother could love. This is about the size of a hamster. It's called the star-nosed mole, for obvious reasons. And it's a blind creature that lives in North America, in the northern parts of North America, in the wetlands. And it's blind, and it moves around through the sense of smell and touch. And in fact, the nose has these 25 appendages, and decorating those appendages are these hair-like structures called Elmer's organs that give it a heightened sense of touch and smell that allows it to move through the environment and eat larvae and insects and things like this. Okay, this is my favorite. This is called the bird-dropping spider. So the junior high boy in me is coming out. This is found on the coastal areas of Australia, the southern and the eastern coast of Australia. And this spider is a master of mimicry, as you can imagine, right? Because its appearance wards off predators for obvious reasons. But actually at night, this creature will build these elaborate webs and then will release these compounds that are like moth pheromones that will attract moths to the web so that it's able to eat a meal. This spider has inspired me to come up with a joke. So what did one bird-dropping spider say to the other? You look like crap today. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. I'm never going to get invited back to this church again. Okay, now this is a really cool insect. This is called the thistledown velvet spider. Thistledown velvet ant, sorry. And this is actually not an ant. This is actually a wasp. And it lives in the desert southwest of the United States. In fact, it's known to have one of the longest stingers of any wasp species. It's actually a pretty nasty creature. And its structure, the thistle velvet structure, is actually meant to be a warning sign to predators to stay away from this creature. So anyway, these are just a few of some of the odd and bizarre and unusual creatures that we share planet Earth with. And again, it raises the question, well, why would God create creatures like this, right? What are the purpose of these types of creatures? And this is not actually a trivial question, believe it or not. This is actually a very serious challenge to somebody who holds the view that there is a creator that is responsible for the history and the diversity of life. In fact, many evolutionary biologists will raise this type of challenge, that when we look at the world that we live in, there is this expansive biodiversity. It almost is a wanton biodiversity, and the argument is, why would a creator make a world with that much biodiversity in it? But yet, on the other hand, from an evolutionary perspective, you would expect that type of world. At least this is the challenge, right? Because evolution is an unguided, undirected process. It's a meandering process with no direction, no purpose, no end goal, and it operates strictly through happenstance, through chance, where existing biological designs presumably arise from earlier designs that are then co-opted and modified to create new designs, where the view is that that biological organisms are imperfections. They are suboptimal. That there's no ultimate rhyme or reason for why organisms look the way that they do. And in fact, there are some biologists who would say that many of the biological systems in an organism actually don't truly contribute to its survivability. They really are in a sense, superfluous systems. And so when you look at creatures like the star-nosed mole or the red-lipped batfish, the argument would be these are just simply the outworkings of an accidental evolutionary process. That this is exactly the type of world that you would expect. Now, again, this is a serious challenge. I don't know if any of you have heard of a scientist named J.B.S. Haldane. Maybe some of you have. But he is a scientist that lived in Great Britain in the 1900s, the early 1900s. And in fact, he's a very prominent scientist who is considered one of the founders of the discipline of genetics. And Haldane was an outspoken atheist, and the story goes, and this is probably apocryphal, but the story goes that after a lecture, he was approached by an elderly woman who was a Christian, who asked him, well, what does your study of the creation tell you about God? And so this is kind of a quip that he responded with. He said, well, if one could conclude as to the nature of the Creator from a study of creation, it would appear that God has an inordinate fondness for stars and beetles, right? That when we look into the night sky, there's just this near infinite number of stars. And believe it or not, there's over 100,000 known beetle species that exist on Earth, and probably more than that. And the question then becomes, and this is kind of the point that Haldane was making, why would God create that many species of beetles? What purpose could that many different species of beetles, serve? I mean, granted, beetles play an important part, right, in ecosystems, but do you need 100,000, right? Couldn't you get by with 10,000 or 1,000 or maybe 500 beetle species? So why is there this apparently senseless biodiversity? Now, as a a Christian apologist who works in the science faith arena, and particularly in the life sciences, my first response is to say, well, there's got to be a reason why the red-lipped batfish has these red lips, right? That there's a reason, there's a purpose for everything. And we'll try to come up with those kinds of explanations. And there's nothing wrong with that approach, but in light of this particular challenge, I think that approach is destined to fail. And I realized a number of years ago that I have this tendency, as many people do, to think of God as an engineer, that everything that God has created has a place and a purpose and a reason, and there's nothing wrong with thinking about God in those terms and thinking about the creation in those terms, but is that really the best characterization of God, right? Is that the best way to think about God? And I realize that if you think about God not as an engineer, but as an artist, suddenly it makes sense why there would be all these weird and unusual creatures. This is essentially a reflection of God as a creator. As a creator, God is compelled to create. He delights in that which he creates. It's a process of joy, that an enjoyment, if you will, that maybe there actually is an element of frivolity to the creation, where things are created for no other reason than for the sheer joy, for the creator's sheer joy of making those things. In a sense, art for the sake of art, if you will. Creation for the sake of creation. And so when we think about God as an artist, then it suddenly, again, it solves that problem, at least philosophically. But is that a biblically warranted view of God? Is that something that we can justify from Scripture? And I think the answer is yes. When we look at the Genesis 1 creation account, we see that there are, of course, 6 days of creation, where in the first 3 days of creation, God is, in a sense, transforming the earth to make the earth a suitable place for life, and then he's filling the earth with life, right? Where the ultimate culmination of that creative activity is the creation of human beings in his image, right? But after every day of creation, there is this description of that which God made as being good, right? And if you kind of anthropomorphize God a little bit, which is, you have to be careful about this, it's almost, the image I get is almost of an artist who just pauses after he's done or she's done something, and then just takes a moment to admire it, right? So as God is carrying out his work as creator, it almost feels as if he's pausing for a moment to just revel in that which he has made. And so this is the way the Genesis 1 account ends. Very familiar words, but God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in their vast array. Even when you see that expression, the vast array, right, that connotes kind of an artistry, right? And it's interesting because the Hebrew word that's translated as good is tov, right? And that can mean good. It can also mean beautiful. It can mean that which is made the way it is supposed to be made. And so each day of creation, God is pausing to make the point that what he has made is exactly as he intended, and that it is something that is beautiful. That again, there's an artistry to the creation as well as a functionality. This is another passage of Scripture that I just adore, and this is from Psalm 104. Psalm 104 is one of the creation psalms. There's, I don't know, about 10 or so of the psalms that are called creation psalms, where the psalmist is reflecting upon the creation or reflecting upon God's work as creator, and from that reflection is motivated to worship and to praise the Creator. Psalm 104 is an interesting creation psalm in that it mirrors Genesis 1. That different parts of Psalm 104 correspond to the different days of creation. Now, Psalm 104 is rich, is a very rich passage of Scripture, because what the psalmist is doing is, before he describes God's work as creator on a particular day, he looks backward as to what the earth or what things were like before that act of creation, describes the act of creation, and then looks at how that act of creation cashes out in subsequent days of creation. So there's a progression that the psalmist is describing to God's creative activity, but there's also this back and forth cadence to it. But it's a lot of fun to sit down with Psalm 104 and Genesis 1 to see how the two passages of Scripture correspond to one another. But in the portion that corresponds to the fifth or sixth day of creation, it says this: "How many are your works, Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. There the ships go to and fro, and the Leviathan which you formed to frolic there." Now here, Leviathan would be in reference to probably whales or dolphins, porpoises. And look at the purpose of those creatures: to frolic, to play. God created these creatures with their intent and purpose simply to be creatures that play in the ocean, right? That's the type of thing that an artist would do. So when we think about, again, God as an artist, it solves this problem about why the world is full of this, crazy biodiversity that is so enjoyable, so marvelous to behold. It's an idea that has biblical warrant, but it also sets the stage for us to make an argument for God's existence. And this is an argument that I think is underutilized, but it's a very powerful argument. It's called the argument from beauty. And maybe some of you are familiar with this argument, or you've heard this argument before. But what I like about this argument is that it's a rich, robust argument, but it's actually quite accessible. You don't have to be a philosopher or a theologian or a scientist to appreciate the power of this argument, or to use this argument yourself. And in fact, what's wonderful about this argument is that there's an emotional aspect to the argument, because we have all experienced beauty and have been moved by beauty. So it's an intellectual argument, but it's also an emotionally rich and deep argument as well. And there's a number of versions of the argument. The one version I'm going to talk about tonight was made by a philosopher by the name of Richard Swinburne. He's at Oxford University in the UK. And there's actually two aspects to this argument. There's two parts to this argument, as you'll see. And so this is what he writes. He said, if God creates a universe as a good workman, he will create a beautiful universe. On the other hand, if the universe came into existence without being created by God, there is no reason to suppose that it would be a beautiful universe, right? So he's arguing using a technique known as the argument to the best explanation, right? What is the best explanation? We live in a world that is beautiful. So how do we make sense of that beauty in the world? Well, there's two possible explanations. There is a creator who's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, who is an artist, and you would expect, if that's the case, for the world to be beautiful. But if, on the other hand, the universe is just a brute reality, then there's no reason to think that the universe would be a place of beauty. So the best explanation is God. Now, beauty is something that has to be beheld, right? There has to be someone to appreciate that beauty. And so this is the second part of the argument. He said there is certainly no particular reason why, if the universe originated, uncaused psychophysical laws would bring about aesthetic sensibilities in human beings. So in other words, if, again, it's just the universe is a brute reality and we're the product of an unguided evolutionary process, why would we be capable of appreciating beauty? But if we are made in God's image, then we would be creatures that would be fine-tuned to appreciate the beauty in the world around us. The beauty that our Creator, in whose image we are made, has created so that we can, again, appreciate that beauty. Now, the whole argument hinges on whether or not evolution can explain what is called our aesthetic sense, right? And what I mean by aesthetic sense is that this is our sense of beauty, that this is our awareness of beauty. But it also refers to the fact that not only do we have this desire to appreciate and immerse ourselves in beauty, that we also have this compulsion to create things that are beautiful ourselves. That's what is meant by our aesthetic sense. And I can tell you this, that trying to account for our aesthetic sense is one of the most significant problems confronting evolutionary biologists as they try to explain the origin of humanity. There's simply not a good explanation. And so what I'm going to show you is different models that people have advanced to try to explain the origin of our aesthetic sense and describe why these models don't work. And these models can be grouped into three categories. The first category is our aesthetic sense is just simply an evolutionary byproduct with no ultimate purpose. Theories that view our aesthetic sense as an evolutionary byproduct maintain that it is the accidental, unintended consequence of other adaptations that evolved to serve other critical functions with no bearing on our capacity to appreciate beauty. So the idea here is this, that, again, evolution is this haphazard, meandering process, and that there are certain features that we possess that contribute to our survivability, but because our brains are so complex, this is the argument, because our brains are so complex, there's going to be capabilities that are just simply byproducts of evolution that serve no ultimate purpose. They don't contribute in any way, shape, or form to our survivability. So that's the idea here. It's just this accidental byproduct of evolution. The other category of explanations is very similar. There's some subtle differences. It's a bit nuanced, but it says this: theories that appeal to genetic drift consider our aesthetic sense to be the accidental chance outcome of evolutionary history that just happened upon a gene network that makes our appreciation of beauty possible. It's just an accident of evolution. Right? So both of them are very similar. There's some, again, subtle, nuanced differences that are a bit technical. But the bottom line is that the response to both of these categories of models is the same. And this is the problem with these two explanations. It's not just simply that we have an appreciation for beauty or that we desire to create things that are beautiful. It's that we as human beings are utterly obsessed with pursuing beauty. We are utterly obsessed with not only immersing ourselves in beauty, but we are utterly obsessed with creating things that are beautiful ourselves. And then we want other people to immerse themselves in those things that we have created. And people look out for things that others have created that are beautiful with the idea that we're going to spend time enjoying the beauty of other people's creations. So we are utterly obsessed with our aesthetic sensibilities. And the things that we create that we want people to immerse ourselves in, whether it's the stories that we write, the poems that we write, the art that we produce, the music that we perform or that we write, and the list goes on and on. These are all, again, acts of creation. These are all things that we create that are beautiful, but these are all ultimately creating fictional, imaginary worlds of some sort that we're inviting people to enter into. And because we are obsessed with this, most of our efforts are focused on some way, shape, or form pursuing beauty during the course of the day or creating beauty. This is what two evolutionary biologists write. Aesthetically driven activities are not marginal phenomena or elite behavior without significance in ordinary life, right? In other words, we're obsessed with making things that are beautiful. It's part of our day-to-day existence. Humans in all cultures spend a significant amount of time engaged in activities such as listening to or telling fictional stories, participating in various forms of imaginative pretense, thinking about imaginary worlds, experiencing the imaginary creations of others, and creating public representations designed to communicate fictional experiences to others. Involvement in fictional imagined worlds appears to be a cross-culturally universal species-typical phenomena. Involvement in the imaginative arts appears to be an intrinsically rewarding activity without apparent utilitarian payoff. We love to spend time in immersing ourselves in beauty or creating beauty because we just enjoy it. There's no advantage to our survivability for creating things that are beautiful, right? That this is an obsession that we have. And this is the problem, is that the more time we spend immersing ourselves in beauty or creating things that are beautiful, the less time we're spending in activities that actually contribute to our survivability, right? Instead of painting a mural on a cave wall, you better be out actually gathering food or hunting if you're going to survive, right? Spending all that effort painting on a cave wall isn't going to bring about your survivability. This is what a philosopher of biology says, Mohan Mathan. But why is this good from an evolutionary point of view? Why is it valuable to be absorbed in contemplation with all the attendant dangers of reduced vigilance? Wasting time and energy puts organisms at an evolutionary disadvantage. For large animals such as us, unnecessary activity is particularly expensive. Right. This brings us to the third group of explanations, which is that actually our aesthetic sense contributes to our survivability. It has adaptive advantage. And there's a couple of ideas that I'm going to play around with from evolutionary biologists. One of them has to do with the idea that we see places as beautiful because those places that we perceive as beautiful are rich in resources and will promote our survivability. So we're attracted to this beautiful lake because in our evolutionary past, being attracted to a lake environment meant there was a source of water, there were fish in the lake, that there's a woodland where we can go into the woods and we can get all kinds of resources that allow us to build structures, to gather food in the forest. It provides us with shade from the sun. There's all kinds of resources in abundance. And so the things that we think are beautiful actually turn out to be those things that actually contribute to our survivability. That's the argument. Here's the problem. Creatures like this, the yellow-banded frog, that's a quite beautiful animal, isn't it? Problem is, this is deadly poisonous, that it exudes toxins from it on its skin so that if you pick it up, game over, right? And so in other words, we find things that are beautiful that are actually dangerous to us, right? We're attracted to things that actually will count against our survivability. Here's another creature. This is called the blue mamba. Look at how beautiful this snake is. It's one of the world's deadliest snakes, by the way. So those things that we think are beautiful are dangerous. Here's my favorite. This is an erupting volcano. A few years ago, Amy and I were in the big island of Hawaii with a few of our kids, and the volcano was erupting while we were there. And it was absolutely spectacular to see the lava flow. But it was driving the state officials nuts because tourists like us wanted to get as close to this molten rock as we could possibly get because it was so stunning and so beautiful, right? So the point is that we are attracted to settings, to environments, to creatures that are absolutely deadly, though they are at the same time beautiful. Oops. Now, another category of explanations that fall under this umbrella is this idea that maybe our aesthetic sense is the way in which we train our pattern recognizing ability, right? Human beings sometimes are called pattern recognizing animals, right? That we are pattern seeking animals, that we see patterns in the world around us. And this is actually very important, right? Because if you see patterns, it means you can predict things. And if you can predict things, that means you're more likely to survive. And the argument goes, we are inherently pattern-seeking animals, but we have to train and become good at pattern recognition. And so our aesthetic sense is part of that training process. That's the argument. Here's the problem. If that was the case, then it would only be little kids that would be interested in beauty and creating things that are beautiful. And as you get older, you would lose interest in that. But actually the opposite takes place, right? The older people get, the more and more time and energy and effort they spend in trying to create things that are beautiful, right? And so you see the opposite from what you would actually predict if that was the explanation. And so, again, it goes back to this point from Mohan Mathan, right? That if, as adults, we are spending an enormous amount of effort getting good at creating things that are beautiful, then it means that we are detracting from doing the things that actually contribute to our survivability. It's no longer training us in pattern recognition. It's actually an obsession that we have that, again, detracts from our survivability. So the bottom line is there's not an evolutionary explanation for how to account for the origin of our aesthetic sense, right? And so this means that the argument from beauty actually is a solid argument. It withstands, in effect, the one challenge to that particular argument. So then why do we create, right? And I think we all in here know the answer to that. We create because we are made in God's image, right? If God is a creator and we're made in the image of God, then we too are going to be creators. It's inherent in our very nature because we bear God's image. Now, when it comes to the image of God, the Bible teaches that human beings are made in God's image, but it doesn't really describe or define what exactly the image of God is. And so there is a debate that takes place even today among theologians as to what is the image of God. And there's a one view called the resemblance view, and there's the representative view and the relational view. I'm not going to talk about those tonight unless you want to talk about them in the Q&A. But the view that I find really the most interesting is called the co-creator view. And this is a view advanced fairly recently by a theologian by the name of Philip Hefner, who said, as image bearers, we are co-creators with God. Now, let me explain what he's getting at. If you look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, you see that male and female are made in God's image. And because we bear God's image, we were given certain commands. We were to multiply and fill the earth, subdue the earth, bringing it under our control. We are to have dominion or rulership over the earth. We are to be stewards of the planet. And the idea here is that Adam was created before there was a Garden of Eden. Adam wasn't created in the Garden of Eden. He was created, and then after his creation, God planted and caused the garden to grow. And Adam was then placed in the garden to work the garden. But the garden represents this place of order. It's a place where the creation was consummated. And it was a sacred space where Adam spent time in God's presence. And the plan that God had was for human beings, Adam and Eve, to multiply and to fill the earth with their descendants who would bear God's image, so that the image of God would cover the entirety of the earth. And that they were to take the order in the Garden of Eden and to spread that order into the world outside the Garden of Eden that was unfinished. It was a creation unfinished, and they were supposed to finish off the creation for God. And so, just as we were co-rulers and co-stewards, Hefner argues that we are also co-creators. And so this is an excerpt taken from a book that I'm working on right now. I'm in the process of writing, and this is my attempt to try to convey Hefner's ideas, that we are to create on behalf of God. We are co-creators just as we are co-stewards and co-rulers. Because we possess God's essence in the image of God as the crown of His creation, we become partners with God. We aren't passive subjects of God's creation, but we have become active participants in which we create new things. As image bearers, we have been imbued with the cognitive and rational capacity to create. We've also been imbued with the will and the desire to create. We are compulsive creators. We have a creative spirit within us. And so I love this concept of human beings as image bearers being co-creators. So the bottom line is this, that because we bear God's image, again, we are compelled to create. And if you think about it, when a scientist develops a theory about how the world works, he has created something. When an engineer designs a building, he has created something, right? When an architect designs the aesthetics of the building and lays out the blueprints, he has created something, right? When a writer writes a story, when a poet produces a poem, right? When a musician writes music or performs music, or when an artist produces a painting or a sculpture or a piece of ceramic, right? Or a dancer produces choreography and then performs it. And the list goes on and on and on. We are glorifying God when we do these acts of creation because we are manifesting God's image. This is bringing glory and honor to God, because just as our Creator has produced beauty in the world that we live in, we too are producing things that are beautiful, that again bring glory to God. And when we enjoy the beauty of the things that other people have created as image bearers, we are entering into a type of fellowship, right? A type of relationship between those who have produced the piece of art and those who are enjoying that piece of art. There is a connection that forms. And when we produce something that is beautiful as image bearers, we are also entering into a fellowship with the Creator Himself, right? Because we are creating just as our Creator has made. So when I think about God as an artist, I find that depiction of God to be incredibly attractive, incredibly winsome. It's remarkable to me to think that this Creator is obsessed Himself with producing a world that is beautiful and is inviting us to enjoy that world and to ourselves become creators as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there and then just, I guess, open up the floor for Q&A or comments or discussion, whatever.
Okay, so I will start. First off, I agree with everything you said. I thought it was great.
Thank you.
Right down my alley. Thank you very, very much. Okay, but I'll play devil's advocate. So wouldn't an atheist argue that humans who are creative have an advantage over other primates and such because they can think abstractly, they can paint on cave walls telling their kids, don't go near that animal or you'll die. So and it's a storytelling. We can put ourselves into the future.
Right.
We can solve problems creatively where if it's just utilitarian, it's just going to fail. but we
Right.
can think our way out of situations. So
Yeah.
there is an advantage to being creative.
Yes.
Would they argue that?
Yes, they would.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be part of the kind of the evolutionary story would be, yes, there's obvious, because that creativity arises out of a capacity called symbolism, right? And symbolism means that we now can represent the world with symbols and combine and recombine them. Part of the problem is explaining the origin of symbolic capability is in a sense just as difficult of a problem as explaining the origin of our aesthetic sense. So it's hard to imagine how to go from a creature that doesn't have symbolism to one that does have symbolism. As people have tried to work out how that could happen from an evolutionary perspective, they're just met with dead ends. So yes, it's an advantage, but how do you get there is the challenge.
That was really good. Okay, so we know that elephants can paint.
Yes.
And monkeys can, do crafts and things like that. But that's because we taught them, right?
Yes.
Can they do it intuitively in nature? No.
No.
Fascinating.
Yeah. But what's interesting is, as human beings, we have another property that makes us unique. It's called theory of mind. Mm-hmm. So in other words, because of theory of mind, I know that what you're thinking, what you're feeling, right? I know that you have a mind, right? Like me. And then that actually means that we, for that reason, are motivated to try to kind of connect our minds together. And that's a defining characteristic of humans.
And animals can't do that.
Animals, or if they're doing it in a very different way than we are. But part of that is we have a tendency to anthropomorphize, right? So when we see animals doing things that that are part of their instincts, right? Like a bird creating a nest, we end up kind of imbuing human properties to that bird. Oh, look at that bird creating this nest, right? The bird is expressing itself artistically. So animals are doing these remarkable things, but it's instinctual. It's not the same thing that we're doing, right?
Okay, so like orcas can't abstractly problem solve, like when they're hunting in pods and three-dimensional, all that kind of stuff, communicating in ways that we don't quite understand.
Animals are communicating.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between what animals do when they communicate and what we're doing when we communicate, because we're communicating with an open-ended language, right, where we can combine and recombine symbols, whereas animals are communicating, but their communication is really relatively limited. Now, animals are capable of problem solving, which is pretty remarkable. But there's some interesting studies that have been done by this animal behavioralist in Sweden. And he's of the opinion that what animals are doing when they're problem solving is fundamentally different than what humans do. And he argues that it's actually, what they're doing is actually through associative learning, right, versus actually what we do, which is mental time travel when we solve problems. And the inspiration for his work was looking at AI systems. AI systems can be trained to do pretty remarkable things. It's all associative learning, right? So you're giving an AI system a training set, and then then the AI system will then, take that training, and then we'll look at these novel systems and produce a response, and then you score it, right? Thumbs up or thumbs down. Yeah. And that score is equivalent to an animal receiving a reward or a punishment. And so AI systems that with associative learning can be trained to do some pretty remarkable things. And so his argument is that this is exactly what animals are doing. And he's built these computer models that he uses associative learning exclusively, and he can reproduce the problem-solving ability that people have observed in animals through that. So, so it's not to say animals aren't doing remarkable things, right? But it's fundamentally different than what we're doing.
That's cool. Okay, one more for me. I'm sorry, I'm hogging the mic, but what are you gonna do? I got the mic. Okay, so would an evolutionist argue that humans that are not creative are at a disadvantage? It's like, so, I obviously have some fashion challenges. So is that going to limit my ability to find a mate because I'm not thinking, of making myself look beautiful, which is just, it comes naturally, but So does that make sense? So
Yeah, it actually does.
So things that we do to draw attention to ourselves, either fashion or
Yeah. Well, the way I would answer that question, which is a really good question, is, kind of building an analogy between creativity and intelligence in this way. You hear about, kind of intelligent tests, but I'm of the opinion that there's different types of intelligence, right? There's not, intelligence isn't just a single capacity, but it's really different capacities. So I love sports, and so there are these professional football players that have this athletic intelligence, right? They, chemistry just comes intuitively to me, which is bizarre, but I can't play a musical instrument, though I love music. And so I marvel at people that are capable of, playing music, right? And I'm not much of an artist, but there's an intelligence in being able to depict things artistically, right? And so I think the same thing is true with creativity, is that ultimately we all are creative. It's just that we have creative capacities in different ways, right? So,
and some people should have the fashion police called on them.
that's exactly right.
And people should not hang velvet Elvises in their house. It's heresy. Okay, you might hear, speaking of animals, like elephants running up and down on the roof. You just have to suck it up and get used to it, because that's our youth kids playing, and we let them play on Wednesday. They can't do it on Sunday. We let them go wild. It's just a rule I made. So we have to, sorry for the loud noises up there. Okay, who has the next question? And it is question time. It's not your opportunity to give the lecture.
So no lecturing, correct?
Sorry.
You're a doctor, right?
Yeah, PhD in chemistry.
Okay. Sorry for dumbing down your education. So you make a lot of good points. I work in engineering, and one of the things about creativity, in which God has given us creativity, I also feel that there are limits on that, for a couple of reasons. When you look at the Bible contextually, it talks about God pouring out his spirit in the last days, the spirit of knowledge, which has allowed us to move so quickly in the last 60 to 75 years than we have since the beginning of time. I don't know the specifics, but when the people were building the tower to get to heaven, very creative, God stopped it. He stumped it. There are things that I have done in my life that I thought were very creative, and God stopped it. For whatever reason, he didn't want me to go in that direction. So the question is, the creativity that we have within us, I believe that there are also limits that God won't let us go past a certain point. Do you agree? Or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, whenever we talk, one of the views of the image of God, let me answer your question this way. One of the views of the image of God is called the resemblance view, which basically says the image of God are certain capabilities that we have as human beings that we share with God. Now, the understanding is that we share those attributes with God, but imperfectly, in a limited sense, right? And so I would say the same thing is true with our creativity, right? There's a limit to our creativity. And, I do believe that God opens and closes doors, and I don't see why that would be limited or wouldn't be or why that wouldn't apply to things that we would create where God is maybe protecting us. But one of the things that is remarkable is how rapidly our technology is exploding, as you said. It's actually frightening at some level. When you start looking at some of the advances that are happening in AI or biotechnology, they're happening so fast that nobody has time to even process or think carefully about the technology before the next advance happens and the next advance happens. But that actually is part of, I think, what makes us distinct as human beings. It's part of the argument I would make for the image of God. Because when you look at, for example, Neanderthals, they were on Earth longer than humans were on Earth, and their technology has been stagnant. It was stagnant. It didn't really progress. And when we show up, within short order, we're going from primitive technology to putting people on the moon, now, developing AI systems and all kinds of other crazy things. So there's something different about us compared to Neanderthals that reflects that capacity to create and to invent, right? But ultimately, you hear this question, related to the point that you're making. Well, should we play God, right? And the way I answer that question is we have no choice but to play God because we're made in God's image. The problem isn't playing God, it's trying to take God's place. And that's what I see at the Tower of Babel. I don't think there is a fundamental problem with building a tower. The problem was they were trying to do it so that they could be like God, right? And so that's what scares me about some of the emerging biotechnologies or some of the things happening with AI, is that it's not in and of itself the technology, it's that there are times where people that are involved in that, or people that project the types of applications, are almost doing it in such a way where they see themselves or humanity becoming like gods. That's, to me, what's dangerous, which is why it's very important for Christians to be involved in these things.
That's good. I'm scared. Okay. Jeremy.
Where do you blur the lines of evolution and adaptation? It's weird. I'm just not sure exactly, because there's some people that say evolution didn't happen, that it was just adaptation for a species, and their body made adjustments. And I'm just kind of, where do you draw the line? Where do you say, okay, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there was somebody who was writing about reasons to believe in our view on evolution, and the way they described it is that RTB is kind of squishy on the topic of evolution, which is essentially reflects the very point that you're making, right? Is that I am perfectly comfortable with what we would call microevolution, variation within a species, even speciation happening, right, where one species produces a closely related sister species. Because in effect, what you're looking at with that mechanism is a design that then is just being varied or fine-tuned or adjusted, right? And I actually see that as a design feature, right? That God creates organisms with these core designs, but then gives them this capacity to adjust to an ever-changing world, right? Where I draw the line is that when you begin to ascribe creative potential to evolution, or the ability to create novelty, right? That's where I start to draw the line, if that makes any sense, right? So, and again, it's not a hard line, but but you look at, like, for example, the origin of human beings in our aesthetic sense, right? To me, our capacity for symbolism, there is a discontinuity, right? That to go from a creature that has non-symbolic capabilities to symbolic capabilities is this leap that I just don't think evolutionary mechanisms can accomplish. So that's an example of where I would draw the line, right? So when you're looking at new body designs, at minimum, does that help at all, or does it make it even worse?
I just, they talk about viruses and how they've changed DNA throughout
Yeah,
various everything.
right.
And I don't know, the validity on that or not,
Yeah,
but I think one thing that's missed in this whole argument is the role of another. I don't know if a virus is an organism, it's not living,
yeah,
but just the role of the virus in the whole evolutionary process as people look at it, or adaptation that,
Right.
that we live. So it just seems that there's so much more to it that people are missing.
yeah,
In my opinion, that there's a lot more to it
right.
that can be looked at than
Yeah.
just this and that. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? A lot more variables.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah, I agree with you. Or I'm sympathetic to your point. So I couldn't tell you. Like I said, I just can't myself draw hard lines. But there's again, the way I describe it is that when you are ascribing creative potential to evolutionary processes, that's where I think that's where I think the line is, right? So I wouldn't say, well, I don't think, you could have, I think you could have speciation. I'm completely comfortable with one genus giving rise to another genus, right? That type of thing. But there is a point where I think evolution can't vary or the design anymore, right? So there are clearly places where novelty is being introduced, and that's where I think you need a creator. And in fact, one of the outstanding problems today in evolutionary biology is how do you explain the origin of novelty? How do you explain the emergence of new structures or new systems, right? So that's where I would draw the line.
Okay.
Yeah. But like, for example, viruses, they evolve, and bacteria can exchange big chunks of DNA back and forth across different bacterial species, right? So there are these, mechanisms that are clearly in operation, in the microbial world that I don't have a problem with.
Okay.
All right, who's next? Yeah.
You mentioned like Neanderthals as a you said evolutionary biologist. That's your role or your
I'm a biochemist.
biochemist.
Yeah.
So what is your best educated guess as to the explanation of Neanderthals? Like how does that fit in with scripture? Like what would you say is the explanation for
Yeah.
what people call early
Well,
man?
I mean, the perspective that I hold and that we hold as an organization is human beings were modern humans. We're, Adam and Eve were modern humans. That's what we are. We're created through God's direct intervention, right? That we were created physically, that we were created spiritually, and that Adam and Eve were the very first human beings that gave rise to everyone. That's the view that we hold. So then what do you do with creatures like Neanderthals? And my view is that these were creatures that God created, that existed, and then that went extinct. That they were creatures that had some measure of intelligence and emotional capacity, but they lacked the image of God. They were, so I would think of them in the same vein as I would think of the great apes, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, as these fascinating, intelligent creatures, but that there's something different, fundamentally different about humans and the great apes, right? And that fundamental difference is the image of God. So that's how I would see the hominins, like Neanderthals, as, I don't see them as evolutionary predecessors.
So you would say like an animal species that went extinct. What about in relation to the flood? Do you find any correlation of could they have existed and then gone extinct during the flood? Is that line up at all?
Yeah, I mean, it would depend, where you place the flood, but it's very clear that humans and Neanderthals coexisted for a period of time, right? And that they did go extinct, right? But I see the flood as being not a global event, but a local event that took place. I think it impacted all of humanity, but it was confined to a local geographical region. So I see it as a real event that, again, impacted all humanity because human beings hadn't migrated at that point, right? But I don't see it as a global event in that sense. So Neanderthals could have gone extinct prior to the flood, right? I don't see their extinction is connected to the flood event, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Would you see AI as a creativity killer? Because in art, I mean, it could pretty much, I could see you got to enter certain parameters to let it know what you want.
Yeah.
But at the same time, once it knows what you want or where you're going with it, in abundance, it can create so many different things.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion on that?
I'm very uncomfortable with generative AI technology. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. It's cool. It's fun to play around with. It could very well be a useful tool, in certain instances, or if it's used in the right way. But what my big concern with generative AI is that it's essentially making humans irrelevant to the creative process. And the reason that bothers me is for the precise reason we've been talking tonight, is that inherent in who we are is our ability and capacity and desire to create. And so it's one thing for AI to take over repetitive, tasks, right? Or to use it to help diagnose diseases or design proteins there's some very good uses of AI to optimize traffic flow or optimize, the grid, the electrical grid. Those are perfectly good applications. One concern I do have with that is that we are ceding a lot of control to these AI systems, right? And that's a separate issue, right? Is that it's more of a question of wisdom than anything else. But when it comes to using AI to create, that to me is deeply problematic, right? It's because, again, now AI is replacing humans in a way that you are stripping humans of the very essence of who we are. That's my problem with generative AI.
I don't think there's an all AI, because I was messing around with one night, and I wanted to test its knowledge, and I was just like, no, it's not right. And then I had to keep asking it questions and delve deeper, and it's all, oh, I'm sorry. And it kept apologizing, but I had to really dig to get the right answer.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was telling me the answer I wanted to hear, or you know what I mean? And I asked it to write a poem that didn't rhyme. It could not do it. It could not write a poem that didn't rhyme.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there going, and I kept asking him and trying to explain it, and not him or it, but I kept trying to instruct it as best I could, and it couldn't produce that.
Yeah.
And it apologized and said, I'm only as good as my creators. So who's ever assembling these AIs,
Right.
and what we have access to and what someone else may have access to are totally different. So you may have like a screenwriter's AI or something like that. I've just seen this as I don't see AI as across the board with just my experience through it. I don't know about yours or anybody's
Yeah,
else.
there's clearly limitations to what these generative AI systems are capable of doing. And you're right. I mean, it is right, that it's how well has it been trained? What does the programming look like, right? But because AI systems can train them or continue to train themselves, it's machine learning, they will become more and more sophisticated. So it may be that today that system can't write a poem that doesn't rhyme, but what about a year from now, right? Could it do that very thing? Or could people come along and program an even more sophisticated AI, or expose it to a larger body of training information, right? So So I think with the generative AI, that's really a place where we really need to think long and hard about what we are and not going to do with it.
Kind of back to the flood. Does RTP have a view on the Younger Dryas asteroid impact theory?
We might. I don't. I'm not even familiar with it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So sorry.
That's all right.
The philosophy of our group. Well,
In my opinion, the real group is you want to make sure that pre-med students are exposed to what's being explained. And you want to make sure that pre-med students, the ones that become Christians. That's what I think the aim is. But maybe I'm wrong.
yeah. No, I mean, in terms of who we target our work at, who's our audience, right? What our mission field, if you call it that, would be people that are STEM influenced, right? So that's the mission field. So we're well, that they would be in that group, but there would be other people in that group as well, right? So we're targeting STEM influenced people, but we also are looking at how do we encourage the church, how do we equip the church to reach out to that group as well. So it's really two audiences. So I'm not going to present tonight a talk that is targeting non-believers when I'm speaking at a church, right? So this is really meant to be a talk that hopefully encourages people and gives people maybe a different perspective or a richer perspective on who God is. And then it's also exposing people to the argument from beauty if they are not aware of it, and with the idea that this may be something they want to dig deeper in and use themselves, right? But I could take this talk and tweak it and present it in front of an audience of non-believers.
Awesome. You're definitely encouraging us. So thank you. All right. So I'm going to ask you an eschatology question.
All right. There we go.
Okay. So, but this is kind of based off of Michael's
Okay.
question. So if, as humans, we create a big enough mess, whether AI or nukes or bio unethics, do you think God will step in and say that's enough?
I don't. That's a great question, and yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry. I'm
okay.
sorry. It's not very. Two in a row here.
I know, right?
But I guess I've always thought that the second coming would be linked to the completion of the Great Commission,
Yeah.
right? So, but at what point and it could very well be that the creation of all this technology is essentially going to actually facilitate the completion of the Great Commission, right? So yeah, I don't know. That's a great
I'm sorry, that
question.
was a whopper.
So what would be your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I agree with you on the Great Commission. I think we're like almost there, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if God's going to rescue us or if, as the church, we're supposed to fix the planet. You haven't,
Yeah.
clearly we've messed things up. So, yeah, I don't know if God's going to rescue us or if we're going to prepare the church to be the beautiful bride. Then he'll come back. It looks like he's going to have to save us.
Yeah.
So that's just my own opinion on that.
Yeah,
one.
well, it's hard to argue
Yeah,
that
I
against
know.
that point, right?
We're on
Yeah.
the edge, Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yes, Heather.
You touched a little bit on the way the evolutionists think. Sorry.
We want you on there.
Okay. Well, you touched a little bit on the evolutionary theories of what people believe or think or can explain. But how, so even if it is that it's for adapting for survivability, but how do they explain beauty? Or how do they explain the differences in, like you had a picture up of the fish and the sea, and obviously that's a very different part of the sea than some of the deep, vast, ominous looking things. And how do they, I guess, I don't know enough about what their arguments are for why beauty does exist.
Yeah. I think if you hold strictly to like a materialistic view, an atheistic view of the world, then I think you would have to argue that fundamentally there is no such thing as beauty. It's all perception. Okay. Right? And I think that would be the ultimate argument. It's just perception. But then you'd have to come up with a reason why we perceive some things as being beautiful and other things as not, or some things as desirable and other things that are not. And it's very clear that, again, what we perceive as being beautiful doesn't seem to have any kind of real utilitarian purpose towards our survivability.
Likewise, people view, we all have different views on what's beautiful. So how
Right.
is that, does that play into it at all too? People are vastly different from each other, and yet we all have different views of what's beautiful and what's not. So how does they argue that?
Yeah, well, right, and I think that expression, right? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So we might differ on what we think is beautiful, but we all agree that there are things that are beautiful, right? And a lot of what we see as beautiful is shaped by our experiences as well, right? But even those things, that somebody creates that I might not find, let's say, appealing, I still can appreciate the creativity that went into it, right? The craftsmanship, right? For example, I'm not into rap, right? It's just not my thing, but I really can appreciate, even though I don't enjoy it, I can actually marvel at the creativity that's being on display for people that produce that type of music, right? Well,
and I think there's something to the creativity in that too, because even AI can produce, or even people, but can produce something that is technically correct, but it doesn't evoke the same emotions sometimes in people as something that somebody is clearly passionate about their creative process, whether it's music or art or things like that. It might be technically correct, but it does not exude a
Right.
response. It's interesting. It's interesting
Mm-hmm.
to see how this evolves.
Right.
Would you say that we get closer to God when we're creating?
I think so.
All right.
Yeah, I think so. And that was the point that I was struggling to make when I was talking about that through creativity, it's a special type of fellowship that we enter into with God, who also is the creator, right? So yeah.
So, like, if somebody is struggling to hear from God, or what's God's will for my life, and
Oh.
they're kind of mopey about not connecting spiritually, would that be a good discipline? Just encourage them to get creative and.
You know, I've never thought about it in those terms, but I think I would say the answer is yes. That would be, I mean, it would be not only would it be therapeutic to some degree, but I think if you're going into it with a prayerful mindset, I think it probably could be a way to deepen that connection, to hear from God.
Therapy where people go and create things to help them get back to the real world.
Yeah.
And going off of that, it makes sense.
Mhm.
Through creation, you're able to heal.
What I was going to say, I hope it's not a dialogue, but it was a question is what I was trying to say. I'm listening to everything that's being put forth, and a lot of it's way above me. I don't have the intellect, let's put it that way. But I'm listening to what you're saying. And the thing you mentioned earlier, you were talking about the difference about creatures and animals and, different creations of God, what he's made. But it's really amazing listening to us all talk. We are able to come together and reason and think and give thoughts. And you mentioned something, we can sit there and listen and, take that concept and put it into our hearts. Or, it's amazing. It separates us from, like you said earlier, from the other creations, the God, the other animals and the creature. We're definitely distinctly different. And it's amazing that no matter what anyone says here, that we're all giving our, poor explanation, 2 cents, but everybody's sharing. And we have the capability to listen and to hear and to receive.
Yeah.
So,
Well, for someone who claims that this was over your head, that was absolutely profound and insightful. So, well stated. Well done.
This may be more of a statement than a question. Getting back to the AI thing, I remember many years ago when I was in school, one of the professors that I had said, who knows, we may be able to create a time machine where we can travel in time. And all of the class was like, yeah, that sounds like that would be a great idea. My response was, that'll never happen. And the professor said, how can you say that? And I said, because we would already know. And he thought for a minute and smiled and said, we'll talk about this later. Meaning that somebody would have already came back from the future and said, hey, we discovered time travel. But I guess kind of my thinking is, to your point where you stated God wants us to operate in his capacity to not be him, but use his capacity. Wouldn't AI be a development of that? We have created something that creates. Wouldn't that be in that capacity? I mean, maybe something to guard and to guide, but moving the creativity to some entity that can create when you just give minimum information or minimum input. That's kind of the same thing God did with us. He gave us these surroundings, and as time goes on, talking about the knowledge, everything that's created tends to build on layers and layers and layers of work that has been prepared over the years, right? We couldn't get to AI before we had the first computer. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea. And although I think that maybe the difference between what God did when he made us as co-creators, if you accept that idea, and what we're doing when we're creating AI is fundamentally different, because we're not making AI in our image, right? Right? We're creating these machines with the capability of learning, right? Versus, God making us as image bearers so that we, are capable of entering into that relationship with God, right? Because we share God's image. So that the image of God is foundational, really, to the gospel, right? And to the idea that we were built to be in relationship with God as image bearers. So I see that as a fundamental distinction between that and those things that we make. But, to some degree, we are the creators of AI, right? But the question is, are we going to create something that we lose control over, right? Or that is so powerful that we don't appreciate the unintended consequences, right, of what we've created. I think that's the real concern.
I mean, the next step could be, C3PO.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like we're just starting with the brain.
Right.
Now we're slowly moving into, I mean, they already have
Right.
robotics that are learning and doing this stuff.
Right. And I don't have a fundamental problem with AI or with robotics. It's just that I think that we've not thought through what are the appropriate applications for the technology. And so we're producing these generative AI systems without really thinking through what are the broad implications of this? What are the implications for the impact on who we are as human beings? There are not those questions are being asked, but I think they're not being asked forcefully enough, or and the question is, do we have the courage to basically say, even though we can create this technology, we really shouldn't, or we shouldn't deploy it in this way. So that to me is,
Leonard Bernstein said that art is a blanking steel, and I don't know who said this, but good artists create, great artists steal. So like there's always this, inspiration, we're ripping stuff off when we create. And I know that that's what AI is doing, because artists are suing AI companies right now because they're taking the likeness of this artist and they're making, a landscape in this style, but they're literally ripping off like human artists, and then they're making a killing on it.
yeah.
Now, I probably like you, I believe that even though, we do steal and we do get inspiration from other artists and other creators, and we'll rip off a tune or whatever, I do believe that since we were made in God's image, we can create things that don't exist. We can create novel things, even though we're stealing and we're borrowing and we're copying. There's always that divine spark where we create something that didn't exist before, and then there's breakthrough in human creativity. Can AI do that yet? Is AI creating novelty, new things that don't exist, or is they just ripping off from?
I think
getting
it's,
data.
I think at this point it's just
Data.
as you're describing. It's ripping things off. It may be combining things, maybe in ways that are novel, but because it's also been trained, right, and you're giving it feedback, it's really producing those things that we're telling it, right, that we like, right. So it's you're not going to. I don't, at least at this point, I don't see an AI system deconstructing an art form and then reimagining it, right? Or even asking the question, what is art?
Yeah.
Right? Which is something that only we can do.
Yeah. Cool. All right. On that note, let's be done. Let's give Fuzz a hand. That was absolutely an amazing talk. Got everybody thinking. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was fun being
Any
here.
plugs
Thanks
for RTB right now? What do you guys got going on? What's next?
I think, go to our website, reasons.org. That's, if you and check us out, check out our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe. We're producing a lot of short content, short form videos now that are a lot of fun to do and hopefully meaningful. And come back next week. I think George is going to be here. George Haraxon, he's going to talk about God as wisdom. So, and I've heard the talk, and it's really good. It's really provocative, so you want to hear it.
Great. Thank you, Fuzz. All right, thank you very much. I'm sure he'll stick around and answer some more questions if you didn't get a chance.